To all of you who dream of love, who believe in second chances, and who know that even the hardest hearts can be softened, this story is for you. If it touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Emma's Stories. Until next time, remember, love is the greatest story of all. Tonight we bring you a tale of two strangers bound by a contract, but destined for something far greater. Adrian Hayes, a billionaire with a heart locked behind walls of steel, and Elena Flores, a woman determined to protect her family's legacy, find themselves in a marriage of convenience. But what happens when duty turns into desire, and the lines between business and love begin to blur? Will they overcome betrayal, ambition, and their own fears to find something real? Stay with us as we unravel the twists and turns of this unforgettable journey. The city skyline stretched endlessly, a maze of glass and steel reflecting the golden hues of the setting sun. At the very top of the tallest building stood the headquarters of Hayes Tech, a billion-dollar tech empire that had revolutionized the industry. Inside, Adrian Hayes, the man behind it all, sat in his sleek, minimalist office. The room was a testament to his personality, sharp, efficient, and devoid of unnecessary distractions. Adrian leaned back in his chair, his piercing gray eyes scanning the contract in front of him. Every word, every clause, had been meticulously crafted to ensure his control. Control was everything to Adrian. It was how he had built his empire, how he had survived betrayal, and how he intended to keep his life in perfect order. 5 years ago, he had learned the hard way what happened when you let emotions interfere with logic. Beatrice Smith, the woman he had once planned to marry, had shattered his trust. She had stolen his company's secrets and sold them to a competitor, nearly destroying everything he had worked for. Since then, Adrian had made a vow: no love, no vulnerability, no distractions. The door to his office opened, and his assistant entered, placing a folder on his desk. Adrian flipped it open, his expression unreadable as he scanned the contents. "The Flores Media acquisition is ready for final approval," the assistant had said earlier. "The board is expecting your decision by the end of the day." Adrian had nodded, his mind already calculating the next steps. Flores Media was a family-owned company with a strong foothold in the media industry. Acquiring it would give Hayes Tech the leverage it needed to dominate the digital content market. But there was one complication. Hector Flores, the company's CEO, had insisted on a personal meeting to finalize the terms. Adrian wasn't one to waste time on unnecessary pleasantries, but Hector Flores was an old-school businessman who valued relationships as much as numbers. If meeting him in person was what it took to close the deal, Adrian would do it. Meanwhile, across the city, Elena Flores sat in a cozy cafe, her laptop open in front of her. The table was cluttered with coffee cups, notebooks, and marketing plans. Elena was in her element, her dark eyes focused as her fingers flew across the keyboard. Elena had built a reputation as one of the most innovative freelance marketing strategists in the industry. She had a knack for turning struggling brands into household names, and she thrived on the independence her work gave her. But her success hadn't come easy. Years ago, during her time at university, Elena had been betrayed by the two people she trusted most, her best friend and her fiancé. They had stolen her ideas and used them to launch their own careers, leaving her to pick up the pieces. That betrayal had taught her a valuable lesson: trust no one and rely only on yourself. Her phone buzzed on the table, interrupting her thoughts. She glanced at the screen and saw her father's name. Hesitating for a moment, she picked up the call. "Helena, we need to talk," her father said, his voice tense. "Hayes Tech is moving forward with the acquisition. There's a condition Adrian Hayes wants to discuss with you personally." Elena frowned, suspicion flickering in her eyes. "What kind of condition?" "It's complicated," her father replied. "Just meet with him. This deal is critical for the company's survival." Elena sighed, her mind racing. She had heard of Adrian Hayes, everyone in the industry had. He was brilliant, ruthless, and completely unapproachable. If he wanted to meet her, it couldn't be for anything good. Back at Hayes Tech, Adrian stood by the floor-to-ceiling window in his office, looking out at the city below. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the skyline in shades of deep blue and gold. He didn't know much about Elena Flores, but he knew enough. She was smart, ambitious, and fiercely independent, qualities he respected, even if he didn't trust them. Two people, both scarred by betrayal, both determined to keep their hearts locked away, were about to collide in a way that neither of them could have predicted. The restaurant was the epitome of luxury, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city lights. The soft hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses filled the air, but at a private table tucked away in the corner, the atmosphere was anything but relaxed. Adrian Hayes sat across from Elena Flores, his posture composed, his expression unreadable. Elena, on the other hand, was anything but calm. She had spent the entire day wondering why Adrian Hayes, the infamous tech mogul, had requested to meet her personally. Now, as she sat across from him, she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever he was about to say would change everything. Adrian placed his glass of water down and leaned forward slightly, his sharp gray eyes locking onto hers. "Miss Flores, I'll get straight to the point. The acquisition of Flores Media is a strategic move for Hayes Tech. But to ensure the stability of the deal, I'm proposing a partnership, one that extends beyond business." Elena raised an eyebrow, her skepticism evident. "A partnership? You mean a merger? What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Hayes?" Adrian's tone remained steady, almost clinical. "A marriage. Temporary, of course. 2 years. It will solidify the confidence of our shareholders and ensure the media division integrates seamlessly with Hayes Tech." For a moment, Elena thought she had misheard him. She blinked, her mind racing to process his words. "You're joking." "I don't joke about business, Miss Flores," Adrian replied, his voice firm. "This arrangement benefits both of us. Your family's company gets the financial backing it needs to recover, and I get the stability required to move forward with the acquisition. It's a mutually beneficial agreement." Elena stared at him, her disbelief quickly giving way to anger. "You want me to marry you for a business deal? Do you even hear how absurd that sounds?" Adrienne didn't flinch. "I understand it's unconventional, but it's also practical. Your father agrees with me. He believes this is the best way to secure the future of Flores Media." Elena's jaw tightened. "Of course he does. He's always been willing to sacrifice anything for the company, including me." Adrian's gaze softened, just for a moment. "This isn't about sacrifice. It's about survival. Flores Media is on the brink of collapse. Without this deal, your family's company won't last another year." Elena leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "And what about you? What do you get out of this, besides a shiny new media division?" Adrian's expression hardened again. "I get stability. My board of directors has been pressuring me to settle down, to project an image of reliability. A marriage, even a temporary one, will silence their concerns and allow me to focus on what matters: my work." Elena couldn't believe what she was hearing. The man sitting across from her was cold, calculating, and completely devoid of emotion. And yet, there was something about him that intrigued her. He wasn't asking for love or even companionship. He was asking for a partnership, one based entirely on logic and mutual benefit. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her thoughts. "And what happens after 2 years? We just go our separate ways?" "Precisely," Adrian said. "The terms of the agreement will be clear: separate residences, no personal entanglements, and a clean break at the end of the contract. You'll be free to continue your career, and I'll be free to focus on mine." Elena shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "You make it sound so simple. But marriage isn't a business transaction, Mr. Hayes. It's messy, complicated, and—" "Unnecessary," Adrian interrupted. "At least in the traditional sense. This isn't about emotions, Miss Flores. It's about strategy, and I believe you're smart enough to see the value in that." Elena's eyes narrowed. "You don't know anything about me." Adrian's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. I know enough. You're ambitious, independent, and fiercely loyal to your family. Those are qualities I respect, and they're the same qualities that make you the perfect partner for this arrangement. Elena looked away, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. On one hand, the idea of marrying a man like Adrian Hayes was unthinkable. On the other hand, she couldn't deny the truth in his words. Her family's company was in trouble, and this deal might be the only way to save it. After a long silence, she turned back to him. I'll need time to think about it. Adrian nodded, his expression unreadable once again. Take all the time you need, but remember, the clock is ticking. This deal won't wait forever. As Elena left the restaurant that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just stepped into a game far more dangerous than she had anticipated. And Adrian Hayes? He was a man who never played to lose. The grand ballroom of the city's most luxurious hotel was transformed into a scene straight out of a fairy tale. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the room, and every detail, from the towering floral arrangements to the gold-trimmed table settings, screamed opulence. The wedding of Adrian Hayes and Elena Flores was the event of the year, attended by the city's elite, business tycoons, and media moguls. But for the bride and groom, it was nothing more than a carefully orchestrated performance. Elena stood in front of a full-length mirror in the bridal suite, her white gown flowing around her like a cloud. The dress was stunning, a masterpiece of lace and silk, but she felt like an imposter wearing it. Her reflection stared back at her, a mixture of nerves and defiance in her dark eyes. Her best friend, Mia, adjusted the veil on her head, her expression a mix of concern and curiosity. So, are you going to tell me what's really going on here? Because this doesn't exactly scream happily ever after. Elena sighed, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her veil. It's complicated, Mia. This isn't a normal marriage. Mia raised an eyebrow. You don't say. I mean, I know you're ambitious, but marrying Adrian Hayes? The guy's practically a robot. Elena couldn't help but laugh, though it was tinged with bitterness. It's a business arrangement. 2 years, and then we go our separate ways, that's all it is. Mia frowned, crossing her arms. And you're okay with that? Pretending to be in love with a man who probably doesn't even know how to smile? Elena turned back to the mirror, her expression hardening. It's not about being okay with it. It's about doing what needs to be done. My family's company is on the line, Mia. If this is what it takes to save it, then so be it. Meanwhile, in another suite on the opposite side of the hotel, Adrian adjusted the cuffs of his tailored black tuxedo. His mother, Tina Hayes, stood nearby, watching him with a critical eye. You know, Adrian, she said, her tone sharp but not unkind, I never thought I'd see the day when you'd get married, and to someone like Elena Flores, no less. Adrian glanced at her through the mirror, his expression as unreadable as ever. It's a strategic decision, Mother, nothing more. Tina stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. Strategic or not, people are going to expect you to act like a husband. Are you prepared for that? Adrian turned to face her, his voice calm but firm. I'm prepared for whatever it takes to make this work. You don't need to worry. Tina studied him for a moment before nodding. Just remember, Adrian, appearances matter. If you want this arrangement to succeed, you'll need to convince everyone, including Elena, that you're fully committed. The ceremony itself was a spectacle. Elena walked down the aisle on her father's arm, her head held high despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. Adrian stood at the altar, his expression as composed as ever, though his sharp gaze softened slightly when he saw her. The vows were brief, the words carefully chosen to avoid any mention of love or forever. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Adrian leaned in to kiss her cheek, a gesture that was more polite than passionate. The crowd erupted into applause, oblivious to the tension between the newlyweds. At the reception, the two of them played their roles perfectly. Adrian was the attentive husband, his hand resting lightly on Elena's back as they greeted guests. Elena smiled and laughed at all the right moments, her charm winning over even the most skeptical onlookers. But beneath the surface, the cracks in their facade were already beginning to show. As the night wore on, Alina found herself standing alone on the balcony, the cool night air a welcome relief from the stifling atmosphere inside. She stared out at the city lights, her mind racing with doubts and questions. Second thoughts already? She turned to see Adrian standing behind her, a glass of champagne in his hand. His tone was light, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. "Or just taking a moment to breathe," she replied, turning back to the view. He stepped closer, his presence both comforting and unsettling. "You handled yourself well tonight." The board members were impressed. Elena let out a bitter laugh. "Glad to know I'm meeting expectations." Adrian studied her for a moment before speaking. "I know this isn't easy for you, but if we're going to make this work, we need to trust each other, at least in public." She turned to face him, her eyes narrowing. "Trust? That's a funny word coming from someone who doesn't believe in emotions." For the first time, Adrian's mask slipped, just slightly. "I don't need emotions to recognize your value, Elena. You're smart, capable, and stronger than most people I know. That's why I chose you." Elena blinked, caught off guard by his words. Before she could respond, he stepped back, his composure firmly back in place. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow the real work begins." As he walked away, Elena couldn't help but wonder if there was more to Adrian Hayes than the cold, calculating businessman he appeared to be. And for the first time, she felt a flicker of something she couldn't quite name, something that both intrigued and terrified her. The penthouse was as cold and impersonal as its owner. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning view of the city, but the sleek, minimalist design of the space felt more like a showroom than a home. Elena stood in the middle of the living room, her suitcase at her feet, taking in her new reality. "This is where we'll be living?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief. Adrian, who had just walked in behind her, set his briefcase down on the marble countertop. "It's practical. The location is central, and it's large enough for us to maintain our independence." Elena turned to face him, crossing her arms. "Independence? You mean so we can avoid each other as much as possible?" Adrian's expression didn't change. "Exactly." She let out a frustrated sigh, dragging her suitcase toward the guest bedroom. "Well, at least you're honest about it." The first few days of their marriage were a study in avoidance. Adrian spent most of his time in his office, buried in work, while Elena tried to make herself at home in a place that felt anything but welcoming. Their interactions were limited to brief, polite exchanges, discussions about schedules, appearances, and the occasional business matter. But the tension between them was impossible to ignore. One morning, Elena was in the kitchen making coffee when Adrian walked in. He was dressed in his usual sharp suit, his tie perfectly knotted, and his expression as unreadable as ever. "You're up early," he said, his tone neutral. "I could say the same about you," she replied, pouring herself a cup. Adrian glanced at the coffee pot but didn't move to take any. "I have a meeting in an hour. The board wants an update on the integration process." Elena leaned against the counter, studying him. "Do you ever take a break? Or is work the only thing that matters to you?" He met her gaze, his eyes cold and calculating. "Work is what keeps everything in order. It's what I'm good at." She shook her head, a small, bitter smile playing on her lips. "You know, for someone who's so obsessed with control, you're surprisingly bad at dealing with people." Adrian's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Elena alone with her thoughts. The cracks in their arrangement became more apparent as the days turned into weeks. Publicly, they played their roles perfectly, attending events together, smiling for the cameras, and projecting the image of a power couple. But behind closed doors, their relationship was anything but harmonious. One evening, after a particularly grueling charity gala, Elena stormed into the penthouse, kicking off her heels and throwing her clutch onto the couch. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice shaking with frustration. Adrian, who had followed her in, closed the door behind him and loosened his tie. "Do what, exactly?" "This," she exclaimed, gesturing wildly. "Pretending to be your perfect little wife while you treat me like a business partner? Do you even realize how exhausting this is?" Adrian's expression remained calm, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Annoyance, perhaps? Or maybe guilt. "You agreed to this arrangement, Elena. You knew what it would entail." She let out a bitter laugh. "I agreed to a partnership, not to being ignored like I don't exist. You don't even try to make this bearable." Adrian stepped closer, his voice low and measured. "This isn't about comfort, Elena. It's about results, and so far we're achieving exactly what we set out to do." "At what cost?" she shot back. "Because I'm starting to think you don't care about anything or anyone beyond your precious company." For a moment, Adrian didn't respond. Then, without a word, he turned and walked into his office, shutting the door behind him. Elena stood there, her chest heaving with anger and frustration. She had known this marriage would be difficult, but she hadn't expected it to feel so empty. The next morning, she decided to confront him. Adrian was sitting at the dining table, his laptop open in front of him, when Elena walked in. She placed a cup of coffee in front of him and sat down across from him. "We need to talk," she said, her tone firm. He looked up from his screen, his expression unreadable. "About what?" "About us," she replied. "This arrangement. It's not working." Adrian closed his laptop, leaning back in his chair. "What exactly isn't working?" Elena hesitated, searching for the right words. "We're supposed to be partners, Adrian, but you treat me like an inconvenience. If this is going to work, we need to at least try to get along." Adrian studied her for a moment, his gaze sharp and calculating. "And how do you propose we do that?" "Start by treating me like a person," she said, her voice softening. "Not just a piece on your chessboard." For the first time, Adrian's expression shifted. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, regret, perhaps, or maybe understanding. "I'll try," he said finally, his voice quieter than usual. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As the days went on, their interactions began to change. Adrian made an effort to include Elena in discussions about the company, and she started to see glimpses of the man behind the cold exterior. He was still guarded, still obsessed with control, but there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when he let his walls down. And for Elena, those moments were enough to give her hope. The sound of heels clicking against the marble floor echoed through the Hayes Tech headquarters. Heads turned as a striking woman with fiery red hair and an air of confidence strode through the lobby. Beatrice Smith was back, and she wasn't here to reminisce. Adrian was in the middle of a meeting when his assistant knocked on the door. Without waiting for a response, she stepped in, her expression tense. "Mr. Hayes, there's someone here to see you," she said. Adrian barely glanced up from the presentation on the screen. "I'm busy. Whoever it is can make an appointment." The assistant hesitated. "It's Beatrice Smith." The room fell silent. Adrian's jaw tightened, his grip on the remote control firm. He hadn't heard that name in years, but the memories it brought back were as sharp as ever. Betrayal, humiliation, and the near consent of everything he had built. "Oh, send her in," he said finally, his voice cold and controlled. Moments later, Beatrice walked into the room, her red lips curving into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Adrian," she said, her tone smooth and confident. "It's been a long time." Adrian stood, his expression unreadable. "What do you want, Beatrice?" She tilted her head, feigning innocence. "Is that any way to greet an old friend?" "We're not friends," he replied sharply. "Get to the point." Beatrice's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. Fine. I'm here because I've heard about your little acquisition of Flores Media. Impressive move, I must say. But I couldn't help but wonder how much of it is business and how much of it is personal. Adrian's eyes narrowed. What are you implying? Beatrice stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. I'm implying that your sudden marriage to Elena Flores seems a little too convenient. Tell me, Adrian, is she just another pawn in your game? Adrian's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Beatrice's words hit too close to home, and he hated that she could still get under his skin. Meanwhile, Elena was in her office at Flores Media, reviewing campaign proposals, when her phone buzzed. It was a message from Mia. You won't believe who I just saw walking into Hayes Tech. Beatrice Smith. Ring any bells? Elena frowned, the name unfamiliar. She quickly searched for it online, and within seconds, articles and photos filled her screen. Beatrice Smith, Adrian's ex-fiancée, the woman who had betrayed him and nearly destroyed his company. Her stomach twisted. Why was Beatrice back? And what did she want with Adrian? That evening, when Adrian returned to the penthouse, Elena was waiting for him. She stood in the living room, arms crossed, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern. Rough day? She asked, her tone casual but pointed. Adrian glanced at her, his face as unreadable as ever. It was fine. Really? She pressed. Because I heard Beatrice Smith paid you a visit. Adrian froze, his eyes narrowing. Who told you that? Does it matter? Elena shot back. What matters is why she's here. Care to explain? Adrian sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's nothing you need to worry about. Beatrice is irrelevant. She didn't seem irrelevant when she nearly destroyed your company, Elena said, her voice rising. If she's back, there's a reason. And if it affects you, it affects me. Adrian's gaze softened slightly, but his tone remained firm. I can handle Beatrice. You don't need to get involved. Elena stepped closer, her frustration evident. This isn't just about you, Adrian. We're supposed to be partners, remember? If you're dealing with something, I deserve to know. For a moment, Adrian didn't respond. Then finally, he spoke. Beatrice is here because she wants something. She always does. But I won't let her interfere with the deal, or with us. Elena studied him, searching for any sign of vulnerability. And what if she tries? What if she digs into our arrangement and exposes the truth? Adrian's expression hardened. Then we make sure she doesn't get the chance. The next day, Beatrice made her move. She showed up unannounced at a charity event where Adrian and Elena were scheduled to appear. Dressed in a sleek black gown, she was the picture of elegance and confidence, her every move calculated to draw attention. Elena spotted her the moment they walked into the ballroom. She leaned toward Adrian, her voice low. She's here. I see her, Adrian replied, his tone clipped. Beatrice wasted no time making her way over to them, her smile as sharp as a blade. Adrian, Elena, she said, her voice dripping with false warmth. What a lovely surprise. Elena forced a polite smile, though her eyes were anything but friendly. Beatrice, I've heard so much about you. Good things, I hope, Beatrice replied, her gaze flicking between them. You two make quite the power couple. Tell me, how's married life treating you? Adrian's hand rested lightly on Elena's back, a subtle but protective gesture. We're doing just fine, he said, his voice calm but firm. Beatrice's smile widened, but there was a glint of mischief in her eyes. I'm sure you are. After all, Adrian always knows how to get what he wants. Elena's jaw tightened, but she kept her composure. And I'm sure you know all about that, don't you, Beatrice? The tension between the three of them was palpable, but before Beatrice could respond, Adrian stepped in. If you'll excuse us, we have other guests to greet. As they walked away, Elena leaned closer to Adrian, her voice low. She's not going to back off, is she? No, Adrian admitted. but she won't win. I won't let her. For the first time, Elena saw a flicker of vulnerability in Adrian's eyes, a glimpse of the man behind the mask. And in that moment, she realized that their fight against Beatrice wasn't just about protecting their arrangement. It was about protecting each other. The days following Beatrice's reappearance were tense. Adrian became more withdrawn, spending long hours in his office or at Hayes Tech, while Elena found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, wondering when Beatrice would strike next. The carefully constructed facade of their marriage was beginning to feel like a house of cards, and Elena couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down. One evening, Elena returned to the penthouse after a long day at Florist Media. She was exhausted, her mind racing with ideas for a new campaign, but the moment she stepped inside, she knew something was wrong. The lights in the living room were dim, and Adrian was sitting on the couch, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. "You're home late," he said, his voice low. Elena set her bag down, kicking off her heels. "I had a meeting that ran over. You know how it is." Adrian nodded, taking a sip of his drink. "Beatrice came by the office again today." Elena froze, her heart sinking. What did she want this time? Adrian's jaw tightened. "The same thing she always wants: control. She's trying to dig into our marriage, looking for cracks she can exploit." Elena crossed her arms, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "And what are you doing about it? Because sitting here drinking isn't exactly a solution." Adrian's eyes flashed with anger, but he kept his voice calm. "I'm handling it, Elena. You don't need to worry." "Don't tell me not to worry," she shot back. "This affects both of us, Adrian. If she exposes the truth about our arrangement, everything we've worked for will fall apart." Adrian stood, his movements sharp and deliberate. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't feel the weight of this every single day?" Elena stared at him, caught off guard by the raw emotion in his voice. For the first time, she saw the cracks in his armor, the vulnerability he worked so hard to hide. "Then stop shutting me out," she said softly. "We're supposed to be in this together, remember? But you keep acting like it's all on you." Adrian ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "I'm not used to relying on anyone, Elena. I've spent my entire life building walls, keeping people at a distance. It's how I've survived." Elena stepped closer, her voice gentle but firm. "Maybe it's time to let someone in. You don't have to do this alone, Adrian. I'm here, whether you like it or not." For a moment, Adrian didn't respond. Then slowly, he nodded. "You're right. I've been handling this the wrong way. But if we're going to fight Beatrice, we need to be a team." Elena smiled faintly, relief washing over her. "Finally, something we agree on." The next day, Adrian and Elena presented a united front at a high-profile business conference. They arrived together, their hands lightly brushing as they walked through the crowd. To the outside world, they were the perfect power couple, confident, composed, and completely in sync. But behind the scenes, they were working tirelessly to counter Beatrice's moves. Adrian had his legal team digging into her recent activities, while Elena used her connections in the media world to control the narrative surrounding their marriage. One evening, as they sat in the penthouse reviewing their strategy, Adrian glanced at Elena, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You're good at this," he said. Elena looked up from her laptop, surprised. "What?" "At navigating chaos," he replied. "Most people would have crumbled by now, but you thrive under pressure." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "I wouldn't say I'm thriving. I'm just trying to keep up." Adrian's gaze softened, and for a moment, the tension between them melted away. "You're doing more than keeping up, Elena. You're proving that you're stronger than anyone gives you credit for." Elena felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words, but she quickly pushed it aside. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. As the days turned into weeks, the dynamic between Adrian and Elena began to shift. They still argued, still clashed over their differences, But there was an underlying respect that hadn't been there before, and in the quiet moments when they were working late into the night or sharing a rare meal together, they found themselves opening up in ways neither of them had expected. One night, as they sat on the balcony overlooking the city, Adrian turned to Elena, his expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. "Do you ever wonder what your life would be like if you hadn't agreed to this?" Elena thought for a moment before answering. "Sometimes. But then I remind myself why I did it. My family's company needed saving, and this was the only way to do it." Adrian nodded, his gaze distant. "I used to think that love was a weakness, that it made people vulnerable, easy to manipulate, but now I'm not so sure." Elena's heart skipped a beat, but she quickly masked her reaction. "What changed?" Adrian hesitated, then looked at her, his gray eyes searching hers. "You did." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. For the first time, Elena saw the man behind the mask, the man who had been hurt, betrayed, and left to rebuild himself from the ground up. And in that moment, she realized that her feelings for Adrian were no longer as simple or as controlled as she had thought. But before she could respond, Adrian's phone buzzed, breaking the spell. He glanced at the screen, his expression hardening. "Ah, it's Beatrice," he said, his voice cold. "She's not done yet." Elena's resolve solidified. "Then neither are we." The next morning, Adrian and Elena sat across from each other in the penthouse dining room, the tension between them palpable. Beatrice's name hung in the air like a storm cloud, and neither of them could ignore the growing threat she posed. Adrian set his coffee cup down, his expression grim. "She's not going to stop until she gets what she wants." Elena leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "And what exactly does she want, Adrian? Because it seems like she's not just after the company." Adrian hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Beatrice doesn't care about the company. She cares about control. She wants to prove that she can still manipulate me, that she can still win." Elena frowned, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "So this is personal for her. Great. That makes her even more dangerous." Adrian nodded, his gaze sharp. "Which is why we need to be careful. She's already trying to dig into our marriage, looking for any cracks she can exploit. If she finds out the truth—" "She won't," Elena interrupted, her voice firm. "We won't let her." Adrian studied her for a moment, his expression softening. "You're more confident about this than I am." Elena smirked, though her eyes were serious. "That's because I know how to deal with people like her. She thrives on intimidation, on making people doubt themselves. But if we stand our ground, she'll lose her power." Adrian's lips curved into a faint smile. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not," Elena admitted. "But it's the only way." Later that day, Beatrice made her next move. She invited Adrian and Elena to a private dinner at one of the city's most exclusive restaurants. The invitation was delivered in the form of a handwritten note, elegant and precise, with a single line that sent a chill down Elena's spine. "Let's discuss the truth." Elena held the note in her hands, her brow furrowed. "She's baiting us." Adrian stood by the window, his hands in his pockets. "She wants to rattle us, make us slip up." "Then we don't give her the satisfaction," Elena said, her voice steady. "We go and we show her that we're not afraid." Adrian turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Are you sure about this? Beatrice isn't someone you can reason with. She'll do whatever it takes to get what she wants." Elena met his gaze, her resolve unwavering. "I'm sure. If we avoid her, it'll only make us look guilty. We need to face her head-on." That evening they arrived at the restaurant together, their hands lightly brushing as they walked through the grand entrance. Beatrice was already waiting for them, seated at a corner table with a glass of red wine in hand. She looked up as they approached, her smile sharp and predatory. "Adrienne, Elena," she said, her tone dripping with false warmth. I'm so glad you could join me. Adrian pulled out a chair for Elena before sitting down himself. Let's skip the pleasantries, Beatrice. What do you want? Beatrice's smile widened, but her eyes remained cold. Straight to the point, as always. Very well. I want the truth. Elena raised an eyebrow, her tone calm but firm. The truth about what? Beatrice leaned forward, her gaze fixed on Adrian. About your marriage. About this arrangement you've so carefully constructed. You see, I've been doing some digging, and I've found a few things that don't quite add up. Adrian's expression didn't waver. You're wasting your time, Beatrice. Our marriage is none of your business. Both. But it is, Beatrice countered, her voice smooth. Because if your marriage is a sham, it calls into question everything else, your integrity, your leadership, your ability to make sound decisions. And if that happens, well, let's just say the board might start to lose confidence in you. Elena felt her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to remain calm. You're grasping at straws, Beatrice. Adrian and I are happily married, and no amount of digging on your part is going to change that. Beatrice's gaze shifted to Elena, her smile turning icy. You're good, I'll give you that. But I wonder, how long can you keep up the act? Adrian's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Enough, Beatrice. If you think you can blackmail us, you're mistaken. Whatever you think you've found, it won't hold up. And if you try to use it against us, I'll make sure you regret it. For the first time, Beatrice's confidence faltered. She leaned back in her chair, her smile fading. You've changed, Adrian. The old you would have folded by now. Adrian's gaze was steely. The old me learned from my mistakes, and I won't let you manipulate me or Elena ever again. Beatrice studied him for a moment, then stood, smoothing her dress. This isn't over, she said, her voice low. You may have won this round, but I'll be watching, and when you slip up, I'll be there. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Adrian and Elena alone at the table. Elena let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Well, that was intense. Adrian reached for her hand, his touch surprisingly gentle. You handled yourself well, better than I expected. Elena smiled faintly, though her eyes were serious. We're not out of the woods yet. She's not going to stop until she gets what she wants. Adrian nodded, his expression thoughtful. Then we'll make sure she doesn't get the chance. As they left the restaurant, walking side by side into the cool night air, Elena couldn't help but feel a strange sense of unity with Adrian. For all their differences, for all the tension and uncertainty between them, they were in this together. And for the first time, she began to wonder if their partnership, fake as it was, might be stronger than either of them had realized. The ride back to the penthouse was quiet, the tension from the dinner with Beatrice still lingering in the air. Adrian sat beside Elena in the back seat of the car, his gaze fixed on the city lights outside the window. Elena, on the other hand, was replaying the evening in her mind, analyzing every word, every glance, every subtle threat. She's not going to stop, Elena said finally, breaking the silence. Adrian turned to her, his expression unreadable. I know. Elena hesitated, then added, but I think we rattled her tonight. She wasn't as confident as she wanted us to believe. Adrian's lips curved into a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. You're right. Beatrice thrives on control, and tonight, we took that away from her. But she's not someone who gives up easily. She'll regroup, and she'll come back stronger. Elena nodded, her resolve hardening. Then we'll be ready for her. When they arrived at the penthouse, Adrian poured himself a glass of whiskey and offered one to Elena. She accepted, sinking into the couch as the weight of the evening began to settle on her shoulders. You know, she said, swirling the amber liquid in her glass, I never thought I'd find myself in a situation like this. Fake marriage, corporate sabotage, a vengeful ex. It's like something out of a bad soap opera. Adrian chuckled softly. a rare sound that caught Elena off guard. It does sound ridiculous when you put it that way. Elena smiled, though her expression quickly turned serious. But it's real, and it's exhausting. Adrian studied her for a moment, his gaze softer than usual. You've handled it better than most people would. Better than I expected, honestly. Elena raised an eyebrow, a teasing glint in her eyes. Was that a compliment, Mr. Hayes? Adrian smirked, taking a sip of his drink. Don't get used to it. For a moment, the tension between them eased, replaced by a quiet camaraderie that neither of them fully understood. But as the silence stretched on, Elena found herself thinking about the man sitting across from her, the man who had built walls so high that even he seemed trapped behind them. Adrian, she said softly, can I ask you something? He looked at her, his expression cautious. Go ahead. Why did you let her get to you back then? Beatrice, I mean. You're so controlled, so calculated. It's hard to imagine you letting someone like her have that kind of power over you. Adrian's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Elena thought he wouldn't answer, but then he sighed, setting his glass down on the coffee table. Because I was young and arrogant, he admitted. I thought I could control everything, that I was untouchable. Beatrice saw that, and she used it against me. She made me believe she cared about me, that we were building something real. And when I finally realized the truth, it was too late. She'd already done the damage. Elena's heart ached at the vulnerability in his voice, a side of Adrian she had never seen before. I'm sorry, she said quietly. Adrian shook his head, his gaze distant. Don't be. It was a lesson I needed to learn. It made me stronger, more focused, but it also made me colder. I stopped trusting people, stopped letting anyone get close. It was easier that way. Elena hesitated, then asked, And now? Do you still feel that way? Adrian's eyes met hers, and for a moment, the mask he always wore seemed to slip. I don't know, he admitted. You've made me question a lot of things, Elena. Things I thought I'd buried a long time ago. Elena's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to say something, to respond to the raw honesty in his words, but she didn't know how. Instead, she reached out, her hand lightly brushing his. The touch was brief, almost hesitant, but it was enough to send a jolt of electricity through both of them. Adrian looked down at their hands, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he turned his hand over, his fingers brushing against hers. Elena, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. But before he could say anything more, his phone buzzed, shattering the moment. Adrian pulled his hand away, his expression hardening as he checked the screen. It's the legal team, he said, standing up. They've found something on Beatrice. Elena nodded, quickly composing herself. What is it? Adrian's eyes darkened. Apparently she's been making moves behind the scenes, buying up shares in Flores Media through a shell company. She's trying to gain leverage over you. Elena's stomach dropped. She's targeting my family's company now? Adrian nodded, his jaw tightening. She's trying to force our hand. If she gains enough control, she could expose everything. Elena stood, her resolve hardening. Then we need to stop her, whatever it takes. Adrian's gaze softened, and for a moment, he looked at her with something that almost resembled admiration. We will. Together. As they worked late into the night, poring over documents and strategizing their next move, Elena couldn't help but feel a strange sense of closeness to Adrian. For all their differences, for all the tension and uncertainty between them, they were a team. And for the first time she began to wonder if their partnership, fake as it was, might be turning into something real. The next 48 hours were a whirlwind of strategy and action. Adrian and Elena worked tirelessly, coordinating with his legal team and leveraging every connection they had to stop Beatrice's plan. The stakes had never been higher. If Beatrice succeeded in gaining control of Flores Media, it wouldn't just be a blow to Elena's family legacy, it would also expose the truth about their marriage, unraveling everything they had built. Adrian's contact, a powerful investor named Victor Lang, was the key to Beatrice's plan. Victor was known for his ruthless business tactics, but Adrian had dealt with him before and knew how to play his game. Victor won't make a move unless he's sure it'll benefit him, Adrian explained as he and Elena sat in his office late that night. If we can convince him that siding with us is the better option, Beatrice's plan will fall apart. Elena nodded, her determination unwavering. What's our angle? Adrian leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Victor values loyalty and stability. If we can show him that Beatrice is a liability, that her involvement will create chaos and uncertainty, he'll back off. Elena frowned, her brow furrowed in thought. And if he doesn't? Adrian's gaze hardened. Then we'll find another way. But I won't let her win, Elena, not this time. The next morning, Adrian arranged a meeting with Victor at an exclusive private club. Elena insisted on coming along despite Adrian's initial hesitation. If this is about my family's company, I deserve to be there, she said firmly. Adrian relented, and together they walked into the club, their presence commanding attention. Victor was already waiting for them in a secluded corner, a glass of scotch in his hand. Adrian, Victor said, standing to greet him. It's been a while. It has, Adrian replied, shaking his hand. Thank you for meeting with us. Victor's gaze shifted to Elena, his expression curious. And you must be Elena. I've heard a lot about you. Good things, I hope, Elena said with a polite smile as she shook his hand. Victor chuckled, gesturing for them to sit. Let's get to the point, shall we? I assume this is about Beatrice. Adrian nodded, his tone calm but firm. She's trying to use you to gain control of Flores Media, but what she hasn't told you is that her involvement will destabilize the company. She's reckless, Victor, and she's only in this for herself. Victor raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. And what makes you think I care about that? Beatrice's proposal is... Elena leaned forward, her voice steady. Because you're a smart man, Mr. Lang. You know that short-term gains mean nothing if the foundation crumbles. Beatrice doesn't care about Flores Media or its future. She's using it as a pawn in her personal vendetta against Adrian. If you align yourself with her, you'll be caught in the crossfire. Victor studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. You're quite persuasive, Mrs. Hayes, but Beatrice has made a compelling case as well. Why should I believe you over her? Adrian's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Elena spoke again. Because we're not just fighting for a company, she said, her voice filled with quiet conviction. We're fighting for something real, something worth protecting. Beatrice is driven by revenge, but we're driven by loyalty and trust. And if you side with her, you'll be aligning yourself with someone who will turn on you the moment it suits her. Victor's gaze flicked between them, and for a moment the tension was palpable. Then, slowly, he nodded. You make a good point, he said, his tone thoughtful. I've dealt with people like Beatrice before, and they rarely deliver on their promises. I'll reconsider my position. Adrian let out a breath of relief, though his expression remained composed. Thank you, Victor. You won't regret this. Victor smirked, raising his glass. We'll see. That evening, Adrian and Elena returned to the penthouse, exhausted but cautiously optimistic. Victor's decision to back off had effectively dismantled Beatrice's plan, leaving her without the resources she needed to gain control of Flores Media. As they sat on the couch, sharing a rare moment of quiet, Adrian turned to Elena, his expression uncharacteristically soft. You were incredible today, he said. I don't think we could have convinced Victor without you. Elena smiled faintly, though her eyes were serious. We make a good team, don't we? Adrian nodded, his gaze lingering on her. We do. For a moment, the air between them shifted, the tension giving way to something deeper. Adrian reached out, his hand lightly brushing hers. "Helena," he said softly, his voice filled with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "I know this started as a business arrangement, but it's become more than that for me." Elena's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding. "Adrian, Before she could finish, Adrian leaned in, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that was both tender and intense. For a moment, the world seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them. When they finally pulled apart, Adrian rested his forehead against hers, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what this is, Elena, but I know I don't want to lose it." Elena's eyes filled with tears, her emotions swirling in a way she hadn't expected. "I don't either," she admitted. For the first time, the walls they had both built around themselves began to crumble, leaving them vulnerable but undeniably connected. The next day, Beatrice made one final attempt to salvage her plan, but it was too late. Victor had withdrawn his support, and Adrian's legal team had uncovered enough evidence to block her from acquiring any more shares in Flores Media. At a press conference, Adrian and Elena stood side by side, addressing the rumors that had been swirling around their marriage. "Our partnership is built on trust and mutual respect," Adrian said, his voice steady. "And together, we've overcome every challenge that's come our way." Elena smiled, her hand lightly brushing his. "This isn't just about business. It's about building something real, something that lasts." As the cameras flashed and the reporters shouted questions, Adrian and Elena exchanged a glance, a silent understanding passing between them. They had started as strangers, brought together by necessity, but somewhere along the way they had become something more. And for the first time, they both dared to hope that their story was just beginning.